so much. Good afternoon, comrades. I hope you're all well. This afternoon, today, it's the 14th, it's the 13th of April, 2023. Welcome to our session. But before I can start, I want to congratulate our own chairperson, Professor Vishwa Sekta, for receiving an award after being nominated at the Mid-Career Award from the Human Science Research. I think this is a great achievement that must be celebrated, especially in this platform, consider the fact that he was nominated for his editorship of the Democratic Marxism. And we all know that we are currently on our 7th volume. I think this is a great achievement that must be celebrated. My name is Ruth Mamolava Ndlogotsi. I'm the NUMSA Shop Steward. Currently, I'm the president of SAFTU. I will be facilitating today's session, and I'm very much excited to be hosting Professor Inge Konik, who's going to take us through today's presentation. And just to give a bit of an insight as to who is our main speaker for today, Comrade Professor Inge is an associate professor in philosophy at the Nelson Mandela University of South Africa in South Africa. She teaches environmental ethics, indigenous value system, ecofeminism, continental philosophy, and film theory. Her current research is focused on materialist ecological feminism, ecological promising value system like Ubuntu, the discursive politics of emerging environmental movements, and the environmental and feminist cinema. Let me welcome Comrade Professor Inge to take us through her presentation. Prof, over to you. Can you hear me, Prof?
Yes, thank you, Comrade Ruth. Thank you for the wonderful introduction and wonderful congratulations to Vish. I also wanted to thank you and Vish and Jane Cherry and the other Inge, the copy editor, for all the wonderful work on this book series. So thank you very much. So thank you for those of you who are attending. And it's very fortunate because this is the only time this semester I'm not teaching at this time because it is recess. But I'd just like to break down and give you a bit of a rundown of what my chapter was about. And I'm hoping that indicating some outlines will get you interested in reading it, as well as reading the very important collection of which it is a part. So the title of my chapter in the DM7 is Doing Ecofeminism in a Time of COVID-19 Beyond the Limits of Liberal Feminism. And I use liberal feminism as a foil through which to introduce readers to the more foreign form of feminism called materialist ecological feminism, because as I will explain later, most people, when they think of feminism, they think of liberal feminism, but there are very big differences between various forms of feminism in the world today. So feminism, as it stands, must be seen as a positive development because it uplifts that half of humanity, namely women, who have historically been oppressed and continue to be oppressed. However, given the complex crises we face today, it is very important for feminisms of any kind to address myriad issues facing not only women, but also civilization as a whole. And the COVID-19 crisis was an example of that. So what I try to do in this chapter is demonstrate that liberal feminism has limits that ecofeminism does not have, because I contrast liberal feminism with materialist ecological feminism, paying special attention to the differences between the epistemological frameworks, as these differences speak to their differing capacities for facilitating multidimensional emancipation today. But now, just to give a brief historical overview of where feminism comes from, the movement is said to have started during the French and American revolutions of the 1700s and continued through to first wave feminism in the 1920s among the suffragettes. And then we saw second wave feminism that began in the 1960s. And of the various types of feminism that grew out of that period, liberal feminism is perhaps the most widely known form. It's often seen, according to Beasley, as being synonymous with feminism per se, because it is perhaps the most moderate form of feminism, since adherence to its basic principles serve as the minimal criterion to assess whether an individual is feminist. And the overarching aim of liberal feminism is to dispel that myth that women are not as capable as men are in any matter of life or assuming any role. On the other hand, ecological feminism has very, very different beginnings, roots, and epistemological commitments, as well as aims to those of liberal feminism, which I hope to show is what capacitates it to deal with crises that we are facing today. So what's interesting about ecofeminism is it originated as a grassroots movement among women focused on environmental problems. And this focus, we must always remember, is its organic starting point, implying that subsequent academic attempts to theorize it as a feminism can be at least partially attributed to theorists feeling obligated to refer to existing paradigms. But the form of ecological feminism under discussion today is a materialist version, which has been closely aligned to socialism, but is different, as I'm going to hopefully show. But ultimately, materialist ecological feminism is premised in an embodied materialism. And as Pamela O'Dea explains to us, it is embodied because it enfolds into the analysis of production and ethic of care-centered reproductive labor. And it is materialist because it argues that the subordination of women and the degradation of the natural world are historically and materially related. So in this chapter, I advanced that ecofeminism's pragmatic grounding in everyday contexts profoundly influences its epistemology and, by implication, its emancipatory capacity. And the South African feminist scholars, Kayat Fakir and Jacqueline Koch, actually touch on this, arguing that exploring alternatives and developing analytic and strategic capacities for collective action, grounded in the material and daily reality of working class people, is where revolutionary potential lies. So we're going to look at that a bit later in this presentation, but first let me turn to liberal feminism so that we can see what its contours are, why it is usually the most commonly adopted feminism, perhaps because it demands less, and also why it is, in a sense, debilitated by its complicity with capitalism. So the accounts of liberal feminism vary, but at base, liberal feminism is founded in a rationalist argument. It is based squarely on an acceptance that if individuals are rational in the required sense, their physical structure or appearance are unimportant. And women accordingly should be afforded the same opportunities as men. But while this is a valid point, what is problematic is that the liberal conception of rationality is conceived as a property of individuals rather than groups. And this sees liberal feminism forming part of the logical unfolding of the capitalist ideology of liberal individualism. This results in ecofeminists like Maria Mies forcefully criticizing liberal feminists. For example, she argues, while many of us would agree that our enemy is capitalist patriarchy as a system, and not just men, we cannot deny that many feminists do not even talk about capitalism. Others only want more equality with men and do not even aspire to transcend the capitalist patriarchy as a system. In effect, what this means is liberal feminism on the whole does not link female oppression directly to the institution of private property and or to the nature and functioning of advanced capitalism. And this is a deficit in my view. Related to the latter limitation is another, that liberal feminism fosters single-issue pluralism, insofar as liberal feminists tend to treat their politics as separate from worker struggles, environmentalism, and Black politics, for example. Ecofeminist Inestra King accordingly holds that the version of feminism least able to appropriately address ecology is liberal feminism, a predominantly white middle-class movement concerned with the extension of male privilege and power to women like themselves, not the fate of women as a whole. And accordingly, King argues that if liberal feminists have an environmental inclination, they will more take an ecological or environmental management approach, where natural entities are gained, just framed as resources to be used somehow sustainably in the continually expanding capitalist system. So a primary aim of liberal feminism then is to facilitate women's full participation in the existing economic system, rather than undermining the system on the grounds of its parasitizing of workers, the environment, women, and other marginalized parts of humanity. And the final issue to be considered here in relation to liberal feminism is the cultivation of a consumerist feminist image which traps women in capitalism too. This liberated woman archetype emerged subsequent to World War II and was spurred on by businesses' aggressive marketing to women, not as housewives or people spending for families, but as consumers in their own right. And in fact, the very idea of women's liberation became enfolded in the capitalist consumerist cycle at this point. And notably, this actually transcended race. As Walker argues, with urbanization, women of color moved from a subsistence orientation through the housewife provisioning role to commodity feminism and careerism as markers of both sexual and racial empowerment. But many people with ecological concerns and concerns about the inequalities produced through capitalism really have reservations about the capacity of liberal feminism to address contemporary crises. In fact, some warn, such as Maria Mies, that as the capitalist commodity market creates the illusion that the individual is free to fulfill all her desires and needs, and that individual freedom is identical with the choice of this or that commodity, the self-activity and subjectivity of the person is replaced by individual consumerism. So it basically robs of agency, according to Mies. So liberal feminism's epistemological commitments, its resulting approaches to the women's struggle, do little to facilitate emancipation from the system that parasitizes women and workers. And it was particularly hamstrung when it comes to complex issues such as COVID-19. Now I'd like to turn to the materialist ecological feminism part of the chapter, where I then contrast liberal feminism with ecofeminism and show how it is more appropriate as a remedial tool today. So what is now known as a materialist ecological feminism emerged in the 1970s as a grassroots movement of women. And very importantly, though, it included within its ambit of concern the fates of other oppressed minorities, such as people of color and exploited workers, as well as wider nature itself. The movement was necessarily holistic from the outset, because it emerged out of women's real-world challenges and concerns deriving from the experience of a breakdown related to society and environmental health under capitalism. Basically, caregiving laborers, as social reproduction theorists also acknowledge and celebrate, in fact, realize that human beings form part of a dynamic yet fragile ecosystem through their very labors. And in fact, Saleh would argue, another ecofeminist from Australia, that caregivers actually develop a tentative epistemological framework, which he refers to as a people's science or a barefoot epistemology. As she explains, I'll just give you some examples of these actions. Ecofeminism is found in initiatives like women's legal challenges to giant nuclear corporations in the US and tree-hugging protests against loggers in North India. These actions express a materially embodied standpoint grounded in working women's common sense understanding of everyday needs. Despite cultural differences between women around the world, this politics reflects a common intuition that somehow the struggle for a feminine voice to be heard is joined to the struggle for a nurturing, protective attitude towards our living environment. Fakir and Koch, in their 2018 article, equally argue that the labors of women and caregivers are epistemologically catalytic. They elaborate that women's unpaid work in their communities to protect the air, water, and land necessary to social reproduction also exposes how much environmental damage is due to the externalization of costs by capital. So ecofeminism has an unavoidably critical focus in opposition to capitalism, which makes it radically different from liberal feminism. But it is not necessarily a socialism, although it has affinities with socialism. Socialism, for example, can be critiqued for being less critical of productivism and technology's role in that. And also socialists, even some eco-socialists, which are closely aligned with ecofeminists, tend to steer clear of looking at the parallel exploitation of nature and women under capital. But ultimately, caregiving women as the hyper-exploited group, and specifically through their sex-gender allocated labors, recognize the embodiment within nature and people's dependence on the overall health of the physical environment. This, ecofeminists argue, catalyze an emancipatory epistemology in practice, something which is corroborated by social reproduction theorists. Resonant claims, for example, are made for the catalytic potency of caregiving by Fraser, who argues that it has distinctive normative and ontological grammars of its own, such as ideals of care, mutual responsibility, and solidarity. In effect, what ecofeminists and social reproduction theorists and other marginals argue is that women need to be heard because they are at the forefront of concerns relating to women's, nature's, and other marginalized peoples' parallel exploitation under capitalism. And what is very interesting is how ecofeminism developed is that in the 1970s onwards, it emerged more or less spontaneously in countries all around the world. And we can be very proud that Women African Alliance is spearheading similar endeavors in South Africa against women and nature's parallel exploitation, as well as wider Africa. So in effect, what this shows is women don't need a prepackaged philosophy of society in order to see that their labors and sexuality are resourced under capitalism by men in ways that match the instrumental exploitation and resourcing of nature. Women's caregiving in the home and their related efforts to protect wider nature might go unmonetized and unrecognized, but constitute an actuality, according to Soleil, an activity that should be identified as economic. But the difference, though, is you can have liberal feminists like Marilyn Warren who argue for the necessity to monetize caregiving labor. But ecofeminists, on the other hand, are emphasizing the epistemological value of the caregiving labor itself, precisely because it is standing in contrast to the dominant exploitative ethos of capitalism. Falling within the ambit of social reproduction, the needs to which women respond are demands that cannot be ignored. If they are ignored, the social fabric of society begins to disintegrate, argues Miller. And Miller adds that women's labors, in effect, play out in accordance with biological time, the time it takes to rest, recover, grow up, and grow old. Indian materialist ecofeminist Vandana Shiva likewise observes, again emphasizing ecofeminism's inclusivity, that women produce and reproduce life not merely biologically, but also through their social role in providing sustenance. All ecological societies are forest dwellers and peasants whose life is organized on the principle of sustainability and the reproduction of life in all its richness also embody the feminine principle. So the ecofeminist insistence on the importance of caregiving labor to the reorientation of contemporary societies is consistent and vocal. And this insistence is shared by reproduction theorists, and they also advance, such as Asha Bandri, that the most marked difference between this orientation is the incarnation of liberal feminism, referred to as power liberal feminism. Bandri, writing in 2020, stated that this form of liberal feminism focuses on women's greater professional advancement, increased financial gain, and freedom from caregiving responsibility. She adds that as a result, such liberal feminism makes everyone as insensible to the needs of the vulnerable as privileged persons. She's referring there in her discourse to men. By contrast, ecofeminism stress on the humanity in nature care work and epistemological holism give this movement an added advantage in both diagnosing and remediating complex crises, such as those we face today, COVID-19 being an example of this. So what I then do in the final part of my presentation here and in the chapter in the book is look at the COVID-19 events through an ecofeminist lens and just see how much echoes that are ecofeminist concerns play out in this arena that we were in for several years. And the crises which they emphasize were exacerbated through this, which many of the chapters in the DM7 collection point out far more incisively than I do here. So basically, Soleil, the materialist ecofeminist from Australia, and some of her colleagues wrote a book, Pluribus, Post-Development Dictionary, in 2019. And obviously, shortly after that, you know, all hell broke loose with COVID. And they wrote an opinion piece where they stated that the corona pandemic ends a universe of false promises because it exposed that economic globalization has not brought universal prosperity, but ecological devastation, social disruption, and inequality. This is not news to caregiving laborers, those who are marginalized on the fringes of society, indigenous meta-industrials, and ecofeminists, because these inequalities have been emphasized time and again. Perhaps by them being so apparent in our society, this is a good opportunity to try to address them. But ultimately, the ecofeminist sensitivity also expressed in this opinion piece to multiple overlapping dominations and the need for the simultaneous address are what makes materialist ecofeminism genuinely emancipatory as a movement. The COVID pandemic, as I said, laid bare these dominations. And Soleil and her pluriverse co-authors then add in response to COVID that this offers a chance to right historical wrongs. The abuse of our earthly home and of marginalized societies, the very people who will suffer the most from this pandemic. The viral outbreak is a sign that by going too far and exploiting the rest of nature, the dominant globalizing culture has undone the planet's capacity to sustain life and livelihoods. The unleashing of microorganisms from their animal hosts means that they must latch onto other bodies for their own survival. This view is common to various chapters in DM7 and can also be seen in certain press reflections from COVID. And I was very interested to see uncanny echoes of the Qatari and Soleil opinion piece produced by Melanie Verwoerd, former ANC MP and ambassador to Ireland. Uncannily echoing the Qatari piece, she argued at the time that COVID-19 has highlighted the huge inequalities that exist in our world, our country being one of the most unequal in the world. But then she adds that questioning matters, although it's crucial to do so now, is not something that has been encouraged in the consumerist, growth-driven economic model that the post-World War II generation has grown up in. Yet she says, this epidemic has shown more than ever how intertwined we are as human beings. Ultimately, the globalizing capitalist consumerist model is responsible And COVID-19 has revealed, albeit most cruelly, that everything is ecological. Every entity is related to every other entity in the biosphere. But it is certainly the case, seeing as materialist ecofeminism, being partly derived from a critical theory position, is very focused on the undermining of dualisms. In COVID, it's certainly the case that the man over nature dualism has been significantly undermined. In so far as through this pandemic, people were summarily ripped out of any disembodied view they might have harbored, joining the rest of the planetary ecosystem as just another vulnerable organism. So this suggests that ecofeminists, caregiving laborers, men committed to subsistence ethic often figure out these problems of capitalism without the need for any theoretical implication, quite simply because these insights emerge out of lived experience. Hargreaves similarly argues in chapter 1 of DM7, excuse me, that these are experiences that help meta-industrials to shape the living and breathing alternatives which we so urgently require at this juncture in history. Liberal feminism, unfortunately, was partly undermined through the absorption of second-wave feminism by capitalist patriarchal objectives which blurred many women's political focus. Nonetheless, because of COVID-19, the need for systemic change is almost impossible to look away from, and has been raised increasingly in relation to myriad issues. And one powerfully vocalized issue, which goes back to the ecofeminist focus on the exploitation of women and the exploitation of the care work, came very much into view during the lockdown periods across the world. I, for example, looked at a woman academic interviewed in the Guardian newspaper. She said basically her students and her children are her priority, and she just can't do research during the lockdown because she has to bear the brunt of the responsibility. This, in the article, they reported that men's research submissions increased by more than 50% during the lockdown period, or as much as 50%. In the South African news, for example, in News 24, a woman known only as Working Mom of Two also expressed she felt torn between being a mother and being an employee. And while her husband tries, she bears the brunt of the responsibility. And while these kind of concerns and contradictions were being expressed, which basically shows that capitalism parasitizes caregiving laborers, IMF quarters were prescribing economic capitalist policy-related solutions to COVID-19, which they, in their own words, deemed simply another war that capitalism has to weather. For them, the objective, ironically, was to save the very system criticized and attacked by the ecofeminists, Verwoerd, and others. As Katara Soleil and their colleagues expressed in that opinion piece on COVID-19, the economic masculinist war talk that emanates today disconcertingly corroborates the view that the capitalist paradigm entrenches the domination of masculine power over life-affirming feminine care, something deplorably embodied today in a heavily militarized global neoliberal capitalist disorder. Verwoerd likewise says that this system we are stuck with today is marked with aggression and excess, and she calls for a radical alternative. She proposes that inherent in these inequalities are a cruelty and an unkindness, a deep-seated injustice that diminishes all our humanity. And she suggests that as we start to think about a post-COVID world, we have to collectively find moral courage and outrage to change this. And this, as Fakir and Kok point out, is especially so in the context of poor and working class South African women who before, during, and after COVID-19 lockdowns remain trapped in a failing economy infused with patriarchal and corrupt politics, which place undue burdens on households and fuel domestic violence. Ultimately, materialist ecofeminism proposes an inclusive feminine value constellation in which caregiving is promoted as a potent catalyst for change. This in contrast to liberal feminism, which perceives caregiving as an impediment to women's liberation. Yet, I must emphasize again, ecofeminists advance the project of caregiving to be highly inclusive. It's not an essentialist movement at all. Accordingly, ecofeminist theorists might speak of mothering practices when specifically referring to women caregivers, but also employ broader, more generic terms like holding, which lets us talk about all kinds of sustaining labor regardless of gender role. Materialist ecofeminism constitutes nothing short of a civilizational critique, central to which is a rejection of capitalist patriarchy and its dominant values, which liberal feminism seeks merely to reform and to nuance to the advantage of select women. Liberal feminism, in effect, and what has been lost in similar incarnations of feminism, is the original radical feminist project of changing how men work, think, love, and rule, a project that has been retained by ecofeminists. Ultimately, caregivers, many of them women, but also men, already are presiding over the organic basis of this paradigm shift away from capitalism, which ecological feminists seek, and ultimately boils down to what can be termed by Fraser too as a feminine value constellation. Soleil argues that the suppression of the feminine is truly the all-pervasive human universal. It is not just the suppression of real, live, empirical women, but equally the suppression of the feminine aspects of men's own constitution, which is at issue here. So ecofeminism sounds forth a call to care for all peoples and wider nature, and in the wake of the further exposure of capitalist patriarchal violence through COVID-19, it's surely a matter of urgency for all of us to heed this call now. And I hope that I tried to emphasize the urgency of that adequately in the chapter. Thank you. That's it from my side.
Wow. Thank you so much, Prof. And thank you so much for further clarifying and, continuously when you are making a presentation, I feel very much guilty, especially from the trade union side, that we are advocating for feminism that we don't even know the type. And listening to you, I can hear that we are definitely advancing for liberal feminism, which is a contradiction on our side. We advocate for Marxism, but at the same time, I think these are some of the contradictions. I think your chapter, it's an eye-opener. And perhaps the question that you might even have to respond towards the end is that, how do we take such information, especially to workers out there, so that they can be able to understand and know as to what is it that the eco-materialist feminism stand for. Before I can ask the participants from the group to ask questions, I'm going to request that we raise our hands, and Charles will allow you to speak. I can see that there's a hand that I've recognized from Jacqueline, Prof. Jacqueline Konik. That was the first hand that I've recognized. That's the first hand. I think let's allow Prof. Prof?
Right.
Prof.
Well, first of all, Inge, thank you very much for a really fascinating presentation. But and I especially liked your emphasis on the urgency of the messages you give about how we have to change the existing order in an anti-capitalist direction. But what worries me, and what I'd be interested in hearing more about, is how you see the tension between your role as an academic and a highly skilled analytical thinker, and following the traditional Marxist understanding of how we bring about change, namely through developing a strong mass-based movement. So I'm really asking how one manages this dual role of very theoretical analysis, from which we all learn a great deal, and how to make these powerful and urgent ideas accessible to the majority of people. It's similar to the issue, no, it's the same as the issue Comrade Ruth has just raised. How do we negotiate that tension? It's something I don't have the answer to, but it worries me. So I'd be interested to hear how you see that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prof, and thank you, Comrade Ruth. I think we all stressed about the same issue. The colleagues, ecofeminist colleagues that I've been engaging with, including Soleil, I mean, these women have been at the forefront of materialist ecofeminism from all those years back, and they've been very involved in party politics too. I mean, Wangari Maathai was also involved in party politics in Kenya. It's so difficult, I think, especially with the neoliberalization of universities, where there's less and less time for academics to do engagement work. Personally, I find it very difficult to see how to translate these ideas to the ground, quite simply from a capacity perspective. I'm sure, Comrade Ruth, we could easily develop workbooks and talks and all these kinds of things, workshops, to do feminist, like history of feminism, to work through these contradictions and see where they are. I recently attended a seminar by Focus on the Global South, and that seminar was on agroecology in India and Southeast Asia. And Chuki, the one lady who's at the forefront of agroecology in India, said, you know, the biggest problem is that there is this disconnect between the university bodies, those in the universities who are doing this work, and especially among the movements themselves on the ground, where it's like this divide and rule, and they're very isolated from each other. And if we can create some kind of cohesive synthesis of these movements, to collaborate and co-organize in a transversal kind of way, that's what she feels is missing in India. And she's a movement person, so I don't think it's something that only plagues academics, but it's something that I'd love answers to. I'm very much a unionist, so I'm involved in the union, so that is part of how I try to see how this stuff can be implemented. But at the same time, especially that they're many years ahead of me in my career, I'm at this point very concerned about how do we make this real, and how do we not just benefit the students in our class. And I try to, when students are in my class, try and get them to, you know, share this knowledge and their opinions on this, to spread it, you know. And we've had great success where students, for example, one of the students is permanent staff member of EarthLife Africa. So there are students who really go and run with it, but it's not enough. Academia has to join, you know, the larger union movements and engage and interact. I don't think, though, that the work pressures at the universities currently, especially comprehensive universities, actively allow for what needs to happen. But I would love examples of what can be done, because I'm really at this stage in my career and at Nelson Mandela University, really seeing the urgency of us having to deal with these matters, and also during COVID, seeing what the students went through, especially the students who didn't have good domestic situations. We can't keep looking away from these things. Thank you. I'm sorry I don't have better answers.
No, that's a good answer.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Prof. I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, especially in this space. You know, going back to the space where I am, Prof, you know, especially when it comes to the issues of, I know that they are interlinked there, and the issues of just transition, how we view them as workers, that the issues of environmental, these are some of the issues that will be taking our jobs, and issues of ecological advancement in our space. They are not taken as that positive. Like I said, that we always stand in a corner and close shop, that we don't want to open up for any engagement, considering the fact that they are being portrayed as some of the advancement that seeks to destroy our jobs. How will you advise us, especially in this space? I mean, we are still struggling with the
It's very difficult. And I think one would have to have people with greater expertise in those scientific fields than me. But what, for example, I saw was there was a similar situation with coal mining communities in the United States, where they were actually targeting those wanting to push for environmental accountability and so on of the coal mines, because they said, you're going to take away our jobs. So this is the bedeviled situation we are in now with capitalism, where with the enclosure of the commons, which happened way back when, and as we've been robbed as human beings of land, of the commons, we've become dependent. We've developed a serious dependency on the capitalist system for livelihoods. So I've seen some people talk about how do we transform our industries in a greener way. Everyone wants to live. Everyone needs bread on the table. Everyone needs a salary. But can we find ways of reorganizing our societies? Or at least, like with you, Comrade Ruth, in your situation where you can influence, you can also look at how is nature not the enemy of the worker? How can the government be accountable environmentally as well as ensure jobs? This is difficult, and I think this is what the just transition is about. But again, is it just another round of corruption? I mean, that's the other concern. So I don't honestly think that capitalist accumulation is sustainable, and eventually we will run out of resources. And this is the divide and rule which capitalism does to us, where you are now pitched as an environmentalist against the worker. And for example, me as a unionist pitched against the worker is a contradiction in terms, because I always want to support the worker. I would ask more senior professors for their wisdom on this, and how we would bridge that gap so that it is not seen as a combative space.
Okay. Thank you so much. Are there any other submissions, comments, questions to the comrade? It's open, it's in the house. Prof?
I think that Inge has just raised, is there someone else who's raised their hand? I don't want to speak too much. Is there another hand, Ruth?
No, I think for now it's only yours, Prof.
Okay, well, I think this issue of a just transition illustrates how the notion of justice, which as it was formulated originally in South Africa early in the 1990s, was a transformative notion that meant the redistribution of power and resources. And Inge, I think what's happened is that that notion has been appropriated by capital, if you like, it's been appropriated by a powerful elite, and it's been reduced to mean simply an energy transition. And what is being neglected, as you point to very aptly, is there's a deliberate tension between the two as part of weakening working class struggles, because there's a lot of money involved. You know, the $8 billion, for example, does not pay sufficient attention. The Just Energy Transition Plan does not pay anything like enough attention to workers who are going to be displaced. And I think that's something we need to really put on the agenda, because otherwise a just transition is meaningless. And I've heard people say this just transition is killing us, because they don't see how they're going to be able to survive without their jobs. And it's not just the coal workers, it's also the many, many women who survive by using the coal workers, getting the coal workers to provide a market for informal sector activities. So one of the things I think we need to do in terms of trying to bridge this very dangerous gap between environmental issues and labor issues is to put gender justice back on the agenda for people, to talk, what does it mean? Because it needs, I mean, obviously working people have suffered the most from the climate change and coal mining generally, and now they are being neglected in a process which is claiming to be just and which is actually not providing real alternatives for those who are going to lose their livelihoods. So I think that could be a very powerful struggle that links issues in the way you were talking about what we need to do.
Thank you, Prof. Now I'm going to ask you, how do we get this done? How do we do this? How do we do this? Because, yeah, I often find even some of my more activist students feel very isolated in their aspirations for the country, aspirations for their people. And I don't think the university structures actually cater for what needs to get done at all. Not between students and lecturers, and not between them and people outside of the university.
Okay. I think that was only one hand that I've recognized from the participants. Any other comments? Are there any other comments? I think in an absence of comments, Prof, maybe the last question that I just want to ask you, you spoke about ecofeminism versus ecological socialist. That can you just explain that, the difference between the two? I think I get a bit confused between the two.
Okay, so eco-socialism is very similar to ecofeminism, but refuses to enter into explicit theorization about the parallel exploitation of women and nature as resources. What happens with materialist ecofeminism, this has been something that they have clarified for decades, is many people feel that ecofeminism is essentialist in the sense that they are claiming that only women have some kind of unique affinity or link to nature and so on. And women's bodies are uniquely attuned to nature, things like that, which is not what ecofeminism argues. Rather, it's based on a phenomenological epistemology in the sense that it means ecofeminists argue that the kind of work you do affects your mind, how you see the world, how you see others. But because eco-socialists tend to also still see ecofeminism as essentialist, as privileging women as agents of change because they're biologically different from men, there's been this tension. very famous eco-socialist Joel Coville. He spoke of the subtle tension between eco-socialism and ecofeminism as the two movements being two ships passing each other in the dark of the night, very closely moving together, but never to fully meet. And this is something that I think is the defining characteristic. It doesn't focus enough on gender. I think I would frame it that way. It doesn't really focus on gender. Coville, for example, focuses on ecology, and he focuses very importantly on race. I think one of the key articles for this, which Comrade Ruth, I think you'd really enjoy, given the concerns you raised, was Coville's Racism and Ecology, where he talks about the fact that even in wealthy communities of color, there will be a larger chance of a bad, like a toxic environment than a relatively poorer white community in the same state. So he talks about the splitting of racism and the divide and rule of racism and how it is unecological. And he then extends that to workers and workers' issues too. But that gender justice, which Professor Koch indicated, that is not really very visible in eco-socialism, but very, very much a similar movement.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Prof. Do you want to come in? I can see that your hand is up.
No, sorry, I didn't mean that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who's speaking? Okay. No, I don't see any hands from the participants. I think in an absence of further comments to your presentation, comrades, let me take this opportunity and thank you for your insight about your chapter. And like it has been suggested that we need to make it the point that this information, it reaches to its intended destination so that we can be able to make a difference. I think these are some of the issues that we need to grapple around, with an intention of ensuring that we don't just come in this platform or write books without necessarily changing the situation. I think it will be important that we do that. And then from the labor side, perhaps we need to have a further engagement as to how best we can be able to do that. And then, of course, even the language that will be utilized, I think it has to be the language that is a bit accessible so that the intended recipients can be able to comprehend with it, the language. But thank you so much on behalf of the team for affording us the time to come and make the presentation. And our next session, I think it's on the 18th of May. We will be having the next session pertaining the chapter, like it was pertaining the book, like it was indicated earlier on, that continuously will be going into each and every chapter before the book can be released, and get a bit of a sense as to what is it that the book entails. And thank you so much. And I would like to apologize for not showing my face. I was telling the comrades earlier on that I'm load shedding, and where I am, I had to look for a spot so that I can be able to join this webinar. I think this is our new normal, that we are not supposed to get used to that. And then how do we challenge that? I think it's another topic for another day. But thank you so much, Prof, and the participants. And
thank you, Comrade Ruth. And please, if we can pick this up so that I can have fewer sleepless nights about how do we reach people who really matter. So thank you, comrade. I hope we can engage after this further.
Oh, okay. I think those were your parting shots, Prof. Thank you so much, colleagues. This is the end of our today's session. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you so much. Thank you.